Hello and welcome to the webinar. I am Sophie Chung, CEO of Skarn, and today we have a very special guest with us. Welcome, Russ. Thanks for joining us. So Russ is a trusted independent advisor in the mining industry, particularly on renewable energy sources, and his prior posts include Director of Energy and Climate Change with Barrick, and he's also the past chairman of ICMM's Climate Change Committee. And Russ brings over 40 years of technical and managerial experience to this conversation in helping mining companies decarbonize. So thanks for joining us. And to set the scene, I'm going to present an overview of the decarbonization targets that various companies have committed to. And this slide is packed with information, but the main point that I want to make is that there is increasing pressure for companies to have clear targets, both interim and for net zero, and that many of the decarbonization targets, many of the interim targets are set for 2030 and 2035. I could spend ages talking about this slide, but I'm not going to, because the point that I want to make in this webinar is the importance of renewable energy sources and in the company's ability to meet those interim targets. And so here, what I show is for a selection of these companies, I'm showing you the key levers that each of the companies are pulling for their interim decarbonization roadmap. And without any surprise that the renewable energy sources, their contribution is typically greater than 50% of the interim target roadmap. And there are a few exceptions, of course, but when I talk about renewable energy sources, I'm including the renewable PPAs, and so that's renewable electricity purchased through third parties, and that can be direct, sleeved, or even virtual, so not even connected to the grid that the mine site's tapping into. And then there's also the renewable capacities that mines are building on site, and many of several of these companies, for them, that is one of the main levers that they're pulling. Now, there seems to be a lot of progress, a lot of activity, but Russ, I kind of wanted to go back to a point that you made in one of our previous conversations, and you sort of elaborated on this notion that within the mining companies, there's this school of thought that if you wait a few years, it'll be cheaper, it will be easier, let's just kick it down the line. Shall we unpack that a little bit, because that's really interesting?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on board. Exactly, it's like a lot of the senior management team, when they are asked about renewables, they're saying, well, the cost of solar is going down, the cost of wind is going down, why don't we just wait? And unfortunately, it never gets done, because also with waiting, and even though costs do come down, you still have to deal with issues like life of mine and return on investment, hurdle rates, those types of things. So it's really important that at some point in time you kind of put a stake in the ground and say, let's move forward and let's do this.
Could you provide a little bit of color on the kind of competition within mining companies, for that same pot of investment, essentially, when it comes to looking at renewable energy projects?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. If you look at most mining companies, there is this competition for capital. And, when I was at Barrick, for example, that was always an issue. There's only so much funding available. Typically within the mining industry, I found that, typical hurdle rates are about 15% IRR. Sometimes those get adjusted based on the political situation in that particular country. So sometimes there's some risk adjustment to those IRRs, but that's kind of what you're competing with. And so, it can be difficult. Even though, renewables, everyone kind of wants to do that. A lot of investors are pushing for it. There's this reality, there's this financial reality that the mines have to deal with, that they have to be good stewards of their money. And so they're looking at places where they get the best kind of returns for their investors.
is that where the third-party providers come in? Because I remember you talking about the hurdle rates and how that can be different.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing actually in the marketplace is a lot of mines are going to third parties, independent power producers who operate under a different model. First of all, a lot of times their hurdle rates are much less than miners. And secondly, that's what their business. So they'll go in, install the solar plant or wind farm or whatever it happens to be, and then operate under a PPA. But again, one of the things that's always going to be important is going to be, I guess, a couple things. First of all, they also look at the life of mine because they have to have a certain amortization period in order to recover their investments. And secondly, unfortunately, most renewables don't provide a 24/7 solution. And so mines or the independent power producer has to come up with other ways of providing the power when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. And that's often, the traditional diesel gensets that exist at mining companies.
And I think that, managing that risk is so crucial, isn't it, for mine operations, because they keep going 24/7. And let's unpack that a little bit, because through the research that we do at Skarn, we've had some interesting stories, like, one of the lithium mines in Australia where they managed to connect to the grid, hoping for, both lower carbon electricity, but more reliable electricity, or so they thought. And actually, they're finding that there's plenty of disruption coming from the grid, and so now they're back to square one, rethinking that. But let's unpack that, notion of risk. And is renewable electricity always more risky in terms of secure supply? Because I can think of plenty of examples, especially the remote operations that are reliant on HFO or diesel. I think we spoke about some examples there. It's not so black and white, is it?
No, you have to look at the whole supply chain. Like, how do you get the diesel to the site? And given the remote location of mines and how weather can impact it, most mines are prudent. They do have so many days of storage on site, but if you have a weather event where you have a huge snowfall and you're up in the mountains and the diesel trucks can't get to the site, now what do you do? And you also mentioned, things like transmission. I'm dealing with a lot of mines in Africa right now that, even though they're connected to the grid, as you mentioned, they're having brownouts. And so they're still having to rely on diesel. Or now I'm even seeing that a lot of the utilities are saying, okay, if you want to connect to us, you have to finance the transmission line. So it becomes expensive. And even though, so those are those costs, but you still don't know if the generation is going to be there when you need it. We had a mine in Zambia, for example, that was low cost. We were paying roughly originally like about 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity because it was hydro power. But after a couple seasons of drought, that renewable power was no longer available, and so it had to be supplemented by the utility with fossil fuels, and so the carbon intensity goes up and the cost goes up. So even though you're dealing with utilities, there's issues there. And here in the United States, we have problems with how long it takes to get connected to the grid. And then you have issues with grid constraints. We just transmission capacity to move where the solar or the wind is to where the major load centers are. So again, utilities aren't always the answer to resolving some of these issues, although for most investors and most senior management, that's kind of the thought that that's the safer way to go, is connect with the utility and use their power.
And so Russ, these are, some of the difficulties and the challenges that the industry has or is experiencing in its transition. But what about some of the more positive success stories? Can we shed any light on that? And what are the learnings from that we could share with our audience today?
Yeah, I think that it's not all doom and gloom, that's for sure. I mean, we're seeing mining companies moving forward and doing things. And, a lot of what's also driving it is this move towards electrification of mining, whether that's in material movement or whether that's in processes. And so a natural progression from that is, okay, if you're connected to the grid and you move from diesel trucks to electric rail or conveyors, which are much more efficient, you will reduce, your carbon footprint, but you're still at the mercy of what the carbon footprint is of the electric utility. And so we're seeing mines that are now saying, okay, let's start there, but let's move forward with putting on-site renewable generation. So, because now we're dealing with a much smaller load, and we can now incorporate renewables into that, take advantage of things like regeneration, taking advantage of battery storage, and so forth, to help that mine get to that net zero situation. So that's where I'm seeing. But also some mines are being bold, and I know at Barrick we put a 2 megawatts wind farm in one of our sites, and it was like at 4,000 meters. So there was logistics getting it to the site, but that's kind of what they wanted to do. They wanted to show that it can be done, and wanted to kind of be leaders. It's funny in the mining industry, I have this saying, and I think others do it as well. In the mining industry, everyone wants to be first to be second. No one wants to be the guinea pig and do things. They're all waiting for someone else in the mining industry to do it first before they start implementing those kinds of technologies. Whether it's renewables or whether it's a new mining process. It's kind of that's kind of the inherent attitude of the mining industry, at least based on my experience. But to decarbonize the mines, I think that mines need more push from government, from investors, and they need the incentives to do that. And I think, unfortunately, it needs to be kind of, as I said, a carrot and stick. They need to feel the pain of the price of carbon, but there also has to be some incentives out there. And whether it's incentives or whether it's access to low-cost capital, I think all those things are going to be helpful, helping the mining industry decarbonize.
And so to close off, if you had a magic wand, what do you think you'd change about the mining industry and its current approach to decarbonization?
Yeah, great question. I think when you look at the mining industry, to be honest, you have to look at the various phases of mining. So if you look at mining, it really is a three-phase operation. You've got the development phase, you have the operational phase, and then you have the closure phase. And I think, to answer your question, there's different things that need to happen at each of those different stages. So let's start with the development stage. A lot of the audience will be familiar with some of the technical and pre-feasibility studies that are done in the mining industry. a good example is NI 43101. But if you look at those types of reports that, that talk about mining operations, they talk about reserves, they talk about all those kind of technical issues, there really isn't a section on mine decarbonization. There's a little bit in the infrastructure on power, and there's kind of a afterthought line that says, we'll kind of look at renewable power and so forth. But until that becomes a major or mandated item within those types of studies, those pre-feasibility studies, it's going to be difficult for mines to take a real serious look and implement renewables for both power and for thermal needs. In fact, unfortunately, in the mining industry, you're almost penalized if you kind of stray from traditional protocols with mining, and whether that's in processing technology or in power or heating technology. And so to me, that's where one of the first things that need to change. There needs to be some kind of mandate where decarbonization is part of the process, that it's included in those types of reports, and there is some real engineering and thought that goes into how do we decarbonize the mine, and that obviously includes things like renewables, that includes things like, material movement, electrification, those type, and then things like thermal processes as well. So that's how I would address the kind of the development stage of mining. In terms of operational stage, I think you need an environment where you have technology, innovation, and incentive together to provide 24/7 of reliable, low-cost, competitive power to the grid. That is definitely going to move things forward for mining, because, most concerns, a lot of miners have concerns about renewables not being 24/7. And so if you can move technology and innovation, and there becomes incentives where you have reliable, low-cost power 24/7 to the mine, that's going to be really beneficial. And I think that also helps, when in the development stage, like I talked about before, if in the development, that there's this kind of structure or environment available to you once the mine is built. And then lastly, on closure, I think there needs to be some kind of incentives for mines to take those existing liabilities in most cases and take advantage of their location, their topography, their infrastructure. A lot of them already have roads. A lot of them already have substations, transformers, switchgear. A lot of them have very large pits at different elevations, so you can take advantage of energy storage or pumped hydro storage. I think having incentives that allow the mine to continue as a different kind of entity. Now it's kind of a power entity, which also helps to preserve some jobs. I mean, it's really difficult for communities when a mine closes. There's a lot of lost jobs. And I think if mines can be utilized for renewables and still keep some people employed, I think that's helpful. Now, obviously, you're still going to have some issues with possibly interconnection and queue issues. I think right now in the US, I think there's like 2,000 gigawatts of proposed capacity. Just, it's crazy. It's multitudes of what the demand is, and wait times are like 3 to 5 years. So obviously that needs to be addressed as well. But I think if there's more incentives for mines to take their sites that are closing and to convert those to renewable energy assets, I think that would be helpful as well. So that's kind of the whole mine cycle, and little different answers, some kind of similar answers throughout that process. But I think that's what's important. We tend to think of mines mainly in their operational stage, but we forget that there's this whole development and closure that needs to be thought of as well.
Yeah, and I remain pretty optimistic in that I think we'll see some changes, in the next 5 years in terms of how business is done. I was speaking to a client in the financial sector, and I said to them, look, is sustainability is it ever going to be more than just a box ticking exercise? And they said, well, yeah, and they said that actually within our firm we treat net zero as seriously as zero fatality, and they were pretty serious about it. They said they've got their own emission targets to manage as a bank, and so they're increasingly looking at their portfolios and to see, where are the best performers, who's genuinely low carbon. And so I think it's taken some time, but I do expect that I think in the next few years, all the indications we have at Skarn through our conversations is that there will be change in how business is done. And I think that that's the other part of the equation, that miners alone being really proactive. I mean, as you said, it's a combination of reward and also penalization. And I think that will be coming in the next few years. So a space to watch here. So thanks so much for the discussion, Russ. And I think we open it up to questions. Just as a reminder, you can use the chat function in the webinar to type in any comments or thoughts you have that you would like us to address. Thank you.
Thank you.